Okay, welcome to part 5 of this module on decision making. Now you've seen and heard an overview of the 7 steps of this decision making model that I just explained. And going forward now throughout the rest of this module, we're going to be going through each of those 7 steps of the decision making model one step at a time. And I'm going to have a short video clip for each part that explains that step of the decision making model and then gives you an opportunity to apply that step to an actual decision that you're facing. So the rest of this module, we're going to be going through those 7 steps, which means that you need to have a decision in mind right now that you're going to work through for the rest of this module. It needs to be a decision that's important to you, that you have not already made a decision about, that you don't already know what you will do and what the decision will be, but it needs to be a decision that's important enough to you that you want to think through it and use this process to come up with the best decision you can. So please make sure you've got a good decision in mind to go through the rest of this module so that you can really apply it and help the learning to really take hold. So the first step of this 7-part decision-making model is to identify stakeholders. So what does it mean to identify key stakeholders? It means finding out and figuring out and thinking about who are the key people that really need to be involved in making this decision. Who do we need to involve in making this decision? All right, again, we're talking more about a consultative and or consensus decision-making process, where that implies that there are other people that need to be involved in the process. Questions we can ask to identify key stakeholders are things such as, well, who might be impacted by this decision and therefore need to be represented in the decision. If people are going to be impacted by it, there's a good chance that you need to consider them and get their input and allow their voice to be heard in this decision-making process. So who are those people? Another group to consider is who will be involved in implementing this decision after we've made it. So we might make a decision and then other people have to actually implement the decision and do work because of it. Well, it's a good chance that some of those people might need to be involved in the decision-making process as well. Another group to think about is who might have to pay for this decision. So if it's going to cost money, who's paying for it? And do we need to involve those people in being involved in the decision in some way as well? And the last thing to consider is what kind of people do we need to involve who might have great background in this area, expertise, or information that we need. So these are some of the questions to consider as you're thinking about identifying key stakeholders to involve in some point during the decision-making process. And that's where we begin. Now, as I said, we each need to have our own decision that we're going to work through. I'm going to use an example from my own life as I go through this teaching as well. So I'm going to focus on my network, the ALLC, the Asia Leaders Learning Community. One question, big question that we had a couple years ago was, we know we want to offer an annual leadership summit. And our decision was, where should we offer this leadership summit year after year after year? So that was a big decision we faced. And we worked through this model to try to come up with a good answer, a good decision. So I'm going to use that as we apply it to this model as we walk through the 7 steps. And basically for this situation, for this decision for us, where should we hold our annual leadership summit every year? We basically decided, well, we need to involve our YWAM elders. So our ALLC elders, absolutely, as well as the national and geographical leaders and elders throughout YWAM, because they need to be engaged and involved in encouraging their people to develop as leaders, and they need to be encouraged to come to these leadership summits. So we need to know from them where and when would be best for them to hold a leadership summit as well. So we decided National Geographic leaders, elders, our ALLC elders, those are kind of the key stakeholders that we want to involve in making our decision about where to hold an annual leadership summit. So how about you? Okay, the second part of this decision-making model, the second step, is all about clarifying the question or the decision. So far we've talked about identifying the key stakeholders. Second step is clarifying the decision. So what does that look like? What does it mean to clarify the decision? It really means to clarify and be clear about what are we needing to decide upon today. How many of you have been to a meeting in your life where you come together and you think, why are we here? Why were we here? What was the point of that meeting? I didn't understand what we were supposed to be talking about and figuring out and deciding. Probably if you're like me, you've had that happen way too many times in life where meetings just weren't clear and they weren't good use of time. And part of the reason behind that is that people aren't clear on why they've come together. What's the point of this meeting? So when you're trying to make a decision and you gather a group of people together, make sure you are very clear from the beginning of why are we here? What are we here to decide upon? And I would suggest that you actually take the time to write down a decision statement to clarify for the group. What is the primary decision that we're trying to make, right? And a decision statement is very simple, but also allows us to be very focused and clear on why we're together. Basically, a decision statement just includes what is called a choice word and a result, a very short sentence that includes a choice word and a result. What's a choice word? It just means a word, a verb like choose. A choice word like choose or select, right? Or decide. What's your choice word and what's the result that you're looking for in the decision? So as an example for our ALLC, I remember I said we were trying to decide where our annual leadership summit should be every year. Our simple decision statement was to choose a location for our annual leadership summit. So our choice word was choose. Choose a location. The result was location. We want to know where to hold our annual leadership summit. So the very simple decision statement that we started with was we need to choose a location for our annual leadership summit. And then it was very clear how we were going to spend the rest of our time in talking through that decision. It may sound overly simple, but I guarantee you that this is absolutely necessary for you to be able to spend good, focused, quality time when you pull people together to make a good decision. Start with a decision statement that clarifies exactly what you're here to decide about. Use a choice word and include the result you're looking for. Okay, welcome to part 7 on this module on decision making. We are working through the 7 steps of this decision-making model. We've talked about identifying stakeholders, about clarifying our decision, and now we're on the 3rd step, which is exploring our objectives, or what are the reasons that we're making this decision? What are we hoping to accomplish with this decision? So when we're exploring objectives, what we're really talking about is what do we hope to accomplish in making this decision? What's important to us? All right. Now, I want to use an example from my own life. What happens to most of us throughout our lives, probably numerous times, we make tons of decisions, and oftentimes we get swayed by something, and we make a decision that maybe really wasn't that wise, and we don't use that great of a process. I remember when I bought my first ever car out of college. I used a terrible decision-making process in buying my car. Why? Because I focused in on one thing that was important to me, and I forgot about everything else that was important to me. And if you've ever been surrounded by a salesman before who's trying to sell you on something, they're very good at getting you to focus in on something that they know you really love and trying to sell you on the product because of the one thing you love, and then hoping you ignore all the other things about it that maybe you wouldn't be so excited about, right? Because we have a tendency in our mind to get tunnel focused on one thing about the decision, and we make a decision based on one thing rather than all the things that are important to us. So when I ended up buying my car, I ended up buying my car because of one thing and one thing only. It had an amazing stereo. I took a test drive in a car, didn't really even intend to buy a vehicle that day, but the salesman sold me on the stereo. I love the stereo, it was amazing, and I walked out of the dealership that day with a new car. I didn't think about anything else related to that car and what I was looking for, because I was really looking for something cheap, affordable, that looked good, that ran well, that had low insurance, right? Good gas mileage. I had all these things that I really was supposed to be thinking about, but all I ended up making the decision based upon was, oh, it's got a cool stereo. Think about how many times you might have done that in your life. Even buying gadgets and devices. You buy it because it has amazing screen resolution, great battery life, or because it's got a lot of memory, right? Or a lot of RAM, or because it's pretty, because you like the color. Whatever it is, we've probably all done it before. We've focused in on one thing and made the decision based upon one thing rather than looking at the entire package, right? So it's incredibly important that we explore our objectives. What's everything that's important to us in making this decision so that we can make a good balanced decision and not focus in on one or two things that we really like about an alternative. So think about, what are our desired outcomes? What are we really hoping to achieve with this decision? Do we have any limitations? For my car, yeah, the price was a big limitation, right? Sometimes you have time constraints, price constraints, resources. What are those limitations that we need to think about? And then for the most part, we're just thinking about wants and needs. What do we really want? What do we really need out of this decision? And are some of these things musts or non-negotiables? We absolutely have to have this aspect, or we can't choose that alternative, right? So these are the things we want to think about when looking at objectives. And we also need to think about the relative importance of each of our objectives, because some of them are going to be more important than others. Maybe it's important that it's pretty, but it's not that important. Or maybe that's the most important thing, is that it's pretty, right? What are the relative importance of each of your objectives? Let's look at an example. So this is called a decision matrix, where we're going to list our objectives in one column, and then we're going to add more information about whether it's a must or a want and how relatively important it is into a matrix. So for our objective of the ALLC of identifying where our Leadership Summit location should be each year, some of the objectives we came up with was, well, we know that our Leadership Summit needs to be relevant to the needs of our leaders in Asia or in an area of Asia. We know that the summit needs to be language friendly to whatever languages people speak. We know it needs to be a safe place for people who are coming from closed countries. We know that wherever we hold the summit needs to be accessible, not too hard to get to, and affordable, because people don't have a lot of money to spend. And more specifically, we said it needs to cost less than $50 a day US. If it costs more than that, too many people won't be able to come. We said we want to be able to maximize our elder engagement, the number of elders that can come to the Leadership Summit, and we want to maximize the number of Asians who can come to the summit. So these were some of the most important end objectives we were trying to accomplish in making the decision. And once you've got that list of objectives, whatever they are, then you start thinking about, well, which ones of these are like an absolute must? We have to have it or we won't do it. And which of these objectives are just a want? We really would like to see this happen as much as possible, right? So we went and you assess that as well. Which of these are musts and which of these are wants? Now you'll notice on my list that almost everything's a want. And actually that's normally the way it will be. People have a tendency to identify things as must because it's really important to them, but that's actually not the definition of a must. A must just means it's something that we are not willing to negotiate on. We are willing to set a limit, like in this case, it has to cost less than $50 a day. If it doesn't, we will not even consider that option of the location or the hotel or whatever. So it's a must. We are setting an absolute limit that we won't budge on, right? And it's a measurable limit and it's realistic. And if we're willing to set a limit on something and say it absolutely must fall in these boundaries, then we can call it a must if we want to, all right? But everything else is a want. That tells us it's important. And now what we want to know next is how important is it, right? So yes, it's very important that the summit is relevant to the needs of our people, that it's language friendly, that it's in a safe place for people coming from closed countries, that it's accessible and affordable, etc. All these things are really important, but they're not something we're willing to say, put a must on and say, well, how do you measure relevant to the needs and say it's good enough? No, we just say it's really important. So you'll find that most of your objectives you're going to be classifying and categorizing as a want, but there may be a few that you say it's an absolute, that it can't be more or less than such and such, right? And once you've done that and you have all your wants identified, then for the wants, you need to say which of these are the most important wants and start with the most important one and make it a 10. So in our case, we had 3 things we said were the absolute most important. Has to be relevant, has to maximize the number of elders who can come, and then maximize the number of Asians who can come. And then everything else was still important, but not quite as important, right? So you can see how something's got a 7 or 8. You don't have to use every number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But what's the most important objective? Give it a 10, and everything else relative to that 10, how important are the rest of the objectives? And you get a sense of, okay, these are the criteria we're using to make our decision and how relatively important each of these objectives is. So now I want you to give this a shot using your decision.